Conversations across time. 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 Conversations across time.
In the show you're about to see, I portray Theodor Herzl. The show consists of three historical figures: Ishmael from the 20th century before the Common Era, Theodor Herzl, myself, from the 19th century, and the ambassador to the UN and Nobel Prize winner Ralph Bunche. We will be discussing why the Israelis and the Arabs cannot reach an accommodation since we have common ancestor in Abraham the patriarch.
Welcome to Conversations Across Time, the show that allows you to view conversations between unlikely participants. Tonight, my co-host Babette Josephs and I are joined by three interesting personalities. Seated next to former State Representative Babette Josephs is Theodor Herzl.
Theodor Herzl is the founder of Zionism. Zionism is the philosophy of that the Jews cannot survive without their own state. He lived in the 19th century when there was a lot of anti-Semitism throughout Europe, especially in countries that were supposed to be enlightened like France. And he reached the conclusion that there would be no safety for Jewish people unless they had a homeland of their own.
Seated next to Mr. Herzl is Dr. Ralph Bunche.
Ralph Bunche was the first black man to earn a PhD from Harvard. He was a Nobel Prize winner in 1950 for the negotiation with Palestine to establish the State of Israel. He was a contemporary of Dr. Martin Luther King. He was quite a decorated human citizen. It was a challenge, really, to find some conversation as Ralph Bunche, because Ralph Bunche was original CIA. In fact, he was before original CIA.
Seated next to Dr. Bunche is Ishmael. Ishmael is the firstborn son of Abraham. He was the son of Abraham's wife, Sarah's slave. His mother's name was Hagar, but she was the slave to Sarah. He is the apostle and a primary ancestor of all Arabic people. Twice at the behest of Sarah, Abraham actually banished Ishmael and his mother. And this happened twice, once when Ishmael was an infant, the next time when he was 14 years old. Welcome, Ishmael.
Ishmael was a patriarch, and given his responsibilities, it's easy to understand how he was so influential, but perhaps the most interesting thing, to me at least, about Ishmael is just how differently he's perceived in different cultures.
I would like to dispute some of the things you said in your introduction.
And that's fine, please.
First off, the idea that my mother and I were cast out is, while I admit I do not personally remember it, is something that history does not agree about. And there are several stories in circulation about exactly how we came to leave the household of my father. However, the account that is most noteworthy to those who identify as my descendants is that God instructed my father to send my mother and I out, and that he was assured by God that we would be looked after, protected, and cared for.
And that certainly does make a decided difference in our discussion.
I would imagine so.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So, that being said, Dr. Bunche, I'd like to ask you a question, and that is, since you were primarily responsible for the negotiations which led to the establishment of the Jewish state, I'd like to know what came to your mind as you were, in fact, orchestrating the boundaries. And for purposes of our discussion, we have a map here that actually will speak to Israel. Now this map talks about the 1923 borders of Israel and the 1948 division of Palestine. But I want you to, so we have this here just for purposes of discussion, but we'd like you to explain what you were thinking when you did negotiate that treaty.
I imagine the most important thing to point out about those talks is that they happened in the wake of the assassination of Count Folk Bernadotte.
And let the audience know who the Count was.
The Count was the UN representative that actually was scheduled to negotiate these talks, and there were agreements that were made and a plan that he had presented that in fact did not agree with some of the Jewish points of view at the time. So there are different thoughts about his demise. The Lehi are generally thought of to be responsible for it, but this sets the context for a very conflict-ridden situation. As we discussed the different possibilities concerning the boundaries, most certainly the descendants of Ishmael and those who occupy the land and who were generally referred to as Palestinian had an intrinsic right. The Zionist movement had things in their conversation that I could personally identify with as being displaced and needing a particular homeland focus. So our discussion was really a tug of war between those interests, and it was my focus, rather than to pursue specific lines, to create an atmosphere where we could agree that there needed to be some balance. And I think that the first map there indicates where we began from, and we ended up in a place where the participants felt that it was not the final word on it, so that it was meant to be an intermediate step that would allow us to embrace peace.
Now, I want to point out to the audience, if when you look at the map, actually you'll see with the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, that would be on your left, and that is from 1923. The yellow indicates the Palestinian people and the lands that they occupy, the territories that they occupy. The orange are for this is the area that the Jews occupy. Now that's 1923. Post-World War II, if you look at the map next to it, the orange delineates where the Jews resided as a result of the boundaries, and the yellow where the Palestinians were designated to live. And looking at that, it gives one a visual understanding of the importance of what was going on during that time. So I think for our audience's sake, I appreciate what you said, but some background is needed. I'd like to ask Mr. Herzl, given that you are considered the father of Zionism, what was your idea? And did this map reflect that?
Well, the map reflected my idea partially, but my idea stemmed from the fact that I believe that the Jewish people living in other national countries would never be treated equally. They would never, even though they were assimilated, would never be treated as first-class citizens, and that no matter what happened, and no matter how assimilated the Jewish people were in these countries, there would always be a second-class status. And I came to that conclusion personally in my life when I was not admitted to a fraternity because of my being Jewish, and it was heightened by the Dreyfus affair in France, a country that was supposedly very enlightened and very liberal, and yet Alfred Dreyfus was accused of being a spy, and mainly because of the anti-Semitism in the French Republic. So it became clear to me that the Jewish people needed a homeland, a place of refuge, a place where they could be and practice their own culture, their own religion without any discrimination, because they would never be accepted in other countries.
But of course, going back to what Ishmael told us, that God told Hagar and told him that he would be taken care of, and that he is really the brother of Jews. Jews lived in Muslim Spain for 800 years, so far as I know or have ever heard, as first-class citizens, and participated in the culture, in the mathematical discoveries, in the scientific advances. What Herzl, I think, was talking about was Europe.
Well, that's true, and he was also talking about the rise of nationalism. When nationalism became a philosophy, it became apparent that some nationalistic people and politicians were going to use their ethnicity and their nationalism as a tool to discriminate against other peoples, not only Jews. So when you're correct about that, when the Jewish people lived in the Islamic cultures, they were treated as equals, but that was before the rise of the concept of nationalism and a nation state.
I don't know, it was Spain. Whatever the name is in Arabic, it was still Spain, wasn't it?
History teaches us that during that period of time, the Arabized region that is now known as Spain was divided among several governors, effectively. And when later, after the Muslims were expelled from Spain, it was further divided into kingdoms. So to say that Jews and Arabs coexisted is true. To say that they existed under a unified government is not exactly true.
Jews and Muslims is really what I would say.
Yeah,
I'm not.
Whichever division you use, whether it's cultural or religious.
As the countries became more unified, unification in Germany, you see a rise in the anti-Semitism in Germany. You see this. France is a shock to me, and that's what was the catalyst for me to know that the Jewish people needed a homeland, because if Jewish people could be discriminated against and persecuted in an supposedly enlightened country like France, it could happen anywhere.
I want to jump in. You know what's interesting to me? That when you were having your discussions, I mean, history tells us that in 1901 you met with the Sultan Abu Hamid, and at that point...
And I also met with the Kaiser.
And you met with the Kaiser. And you were proposing that indeed, if the Ottoman Empire would consent to a settlement in Palestine, which was under their jurisdiction, that in fact the Jews, namely the Rothschilds, would wipe out the debt, because there was a considerable debt that the Ottoman Empire had. Now, why I find that interesting is that in your conversations, you were always talking about a homeland as opposed to a state, and you considered this to happen, that it should happen under the auspices of the protection of Germany. I think that most people would find that interesting, that the change that happened shortly, well, when I say shortly, 30 years is shortly, shortly after you were having these discussions, is you were thinking that Germany would be the protecting empire.
Well, at that particular time, there was less anti-Semitism in Germany than there was in Eastern Europe. In Russia and Poland, there was a larger degree of anti-Semitism. In fact, the first aliyahs to Palestine came from Poland and Russia.
Well, now I want to, because you know there's some constraints that we have. We have to take a break, but I do want to come back to have this discussion because I think it's enlightening to the audience as it is to us as participants that Germany was considered a protectorate of the Jewish people. So we'll be back after this break. Thank you.
My name is Warren Cooper.
I'm Mark Hoffman.
My name is Charles Spears, and you are watching Conversations Across Time.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were having a discussion with Mr. Herzl, and we were talking about I guess what seems strange to me, the fact that you viewed Germany as being a protectorate of this homeland for Jews. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we would have accepted any protectorate. The Ottoman Turks had control of the land. Germany, the Rothschilds agreed to pay off the debt of the Germans, and we would have been perfectly happy to have the Germans protect the homeland for the Jewish people. Had I been able to predict World War I and the demolishment of the Turkish Empire and the partition of all those lands and what the League of Nations would do, I might have looked for a different savior for the Jewish homeland.
I want to, and that brings me to a place that I always find very heavy-handed in history, and that is the position of the British Empire.
Oh.
Yes. So I'd like to throw out to the panel that I think we should have at least some discussion about the Balfour Declaration, because the language of the Balfour Declaration, and if you'd like to explain that, and what it said and what England's supposed position was in terms of the Jews.
Well, basically, the Balfour Declaration followed what I wanted. It guaranteed a homeland.
So long as nobody else was bothered.
Right, but it didn't necessarily.
A big if.
But it didn't necessarily define it as a nation state. It defined it as a homeland for the Jewish people, and at that time, we were perfectly willing to accept that because from Russia, after the discrimination and the pogroms, the Jewish people migrated to Palestine, and they bought land from the Arabs, and they set up farms, and things were going along very smoothly. There were some problems, but there's problems anywhere. So we were more than willing to accept the Balfour Declaration at that time because we envisioned a homeland, and I was utopian in my belief, and I believed that we could live peacefully and in harmony with the Arabs.
But the Balfour Declaration seems to me was part of the British strategy to promise to the Arabs that they would have control over Palestine, and then promise to the Jews that they would have a homeland in a territory that was being controlled by somebody else.
Well, to borrow a phrase from American history, as the Native Americans would say about some of our settlers, perhaps the British spoke with forked tongue.
Yes, exactly.
But at the time, we needed a guarantee that eventually we would have a homeland. So that's what we were fighting for, and we proceeded from there. That was a jumping off point.
Was there ever a thought, and certainly I know that during your lifetime, but as you look back at history and what actually happened, does it at least seem to you that perhaps the Jews were used as pawns for the British government?
Everybody was used by the British government.
I would agree with that.
Yes.
I wouldn't just single out the Jewish people, my people. I would single out the Arabs as well, and many other nations in the world.
Well, talk about India, talk about the Irish.
Yes.
I mean,
But
really.
I think that the duplicity of the British government as pertains to the Balfour Declaration, and the Balfour Declaration, for our audience sake, happened in November of 1917, and it was a statement made by the Foreign Secretary of Great Britain, Arthur James Balfour, and he made this statement to the Baron Rothschild. And as you know, the Rothschilds were very influential. It was very influential in Great Britain. And so this statement essentially said that His Majesty's government favors the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best efforts to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Now, you know, on its face, that sounds like it's a great thing.
It sounds like two contradictory.
Exactly.
Two contradictory principles. And something, when I look back over history, is I think how naive was Mr. Herzl and the Zionists and the Arabs.
And the
Well,
Arabs.
it seems rather uncharitable to.
Hey, I'm uncharitable. What can I say? Please, go ahead.
I suppose you could say that you're a communist.
I've been called that before.
I
I don't deny it.
Then in that case, you should consider being more charitable. We can agree that every historical figure has made decisions that, with later information, seem like folly. However, the interests that each historical figure, that each individual person pursues over the course of a lifetime, every interest is related to another set of interests, and those interests can only be pursued in the context of what is available. So,
That's true.
naive.
But
is-
to believe that the British weren't playing both parties against each other.
Why would
for-
anyone believe that? We're forced into a position, and we play that position.
Even though there's a possibility there would be problems at the time, in the main, not that there weren't riots and demonstrations, but in the main, the Jewish settlers from the first and second Aliyah got along reasonably well
Yes.
with their Arab counterparts. They worked together. In fact, the Jewish farmers hired Arab laborers to work and vice versa. So being accused of being naive, and I didn't engage in geopolitical things. I was looking for a homeland that we can settle peaceably, and I also believed that Arabs and Jews could coexist together in a homeland. And once later on, when it becomes nationalistic in a nation state and boundaries, and you start drawing lines and people start fighting over territory and capitals, that becomes the problem. And the British have been playing that game way before the American Revolution. French and Indian War,
For different kinds of reasons.
right, but
of course.
May I just throw this in? Because during the time of the Balfour Declaration, in fact, in June of 1916, which was a year before the Balfour Declaration, the British and the French had secretly held meetings in which they made decisions as to how they would divide up Palestine. And in fact, the Sharif of Mecca made this statement when it came to welcoming Jews into Palestine. He says, "The return of these exiles to their homeland will prove mutually and spiritually an experimental school for their Arab brethren, who are with them in the fields, the factories, the trades, and all things connected to the land, Hussein actually called on the Arab population in Palestine to welcome their Jewish brethren into Palestine. I mean, that speaks to what you're talking about.
Basically what I said.
Exactly.
Yes.
And it speaks to what you're talking about is how naive could these folk be, because actually Hussein bin Ali, who was the Sharif of Mecca, made this statement, and he actually encouraged the Arabs living in Palestine to welcome the Jews.
It seems to me that the use of the word naive takes some credit away from the British in their talent for being able to pull off duplicity well. And from my perspective in the negotiations, it is arguable in a virtual retrospect that the infusion of the colonial rhythms into this pre-existing relationship is in fact the primary or fundamental foundational cause for conflicts that persist.
Yes.
The act of being able to decide on boundaries is a negotiation that is both specific and arbitrary. The absence of many of the Arab states at the Isle of Rhodes made difficult the tug of war between where a line would be. From a perspective where peace is a focus, there are things that must be believed and also things that must be put forward in terms of concessions and things that will dedicate people to the process of peace. The duplicitous nature of the colonial presence clearly has had some indelible effects. And when you put economic interests in the way of justice and humanity, well then inhumanity would seem to be inevitable.
But of course it was the oil that the British Empire wanted, needed to fuel its war machine and its economic machine, and that's still the case.
And I'd like to say, because oil always figures, and obviously we always run out of time when we start to get to the nuts and bolts of a conversation. And what I think we will do is invite you back, because I'd like us to come back and have a conversation, a discussion about oil and its implications in the Middle East. Because as we sit here now and we talk about what was going on at the time, I believe, Dr. Bunche, your analysis is correct. We are actually having the residual impact of decisions that were made, and it's exactly what Mr. Herzl was saying. When you start drawing boundaries, when you start with nationalism, you can create problems, and that is what we are right now living. The horror that's going on in the Middle East is something that was incubated for a period of time, and I believe it started with the idea of the boundaries. Thank you for joining us tonight. Please come back next week to hear the rest of this most interesting conversation across time. I am Vivian Crawford. Good night.